Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sir, as I rise, I'm smiling, not just because I am very happy to welcome the Honourable Member for St. James North, but because I was at risk of getting completely lost in that meandering stream of consciousness that we were just subject to. I mean, really, my laughing now is almost bordering on delirium from having experienced that quote-unquote presentation. So many ifs and conjecture about things that collide not at all with reality in the legislation. If my grandmother had wheels, she would be a bicycle. I mean, you could say if about anything. That cannot be the basis for a reply or for an assessment of a piece of legislation. But I will come to that, sir. I cannot come to my feet on this occasion without officially registering my congratulations to the Honourable Member for St. James North for being with us in this honourable place today. You know, around 2017, 2018, when we were many of us were in pursuit of the achievement that the Honourable Member has now met, he supported many of us in that pursuit. And I recall making a call to this person that I was just meeting and just hearing some of his thoughts and ideas for the development of the country, and asking him to speak at one of the meetings in my constituency, and he came right away and he spoke impressively. And what many people outside of St. James North may not have yet discovered is that after he spoke creditably, then he was ready to lime extensively, which is also a part of engagement. Also ready to listen closely. For those of us who were with him over the last month or so, one of the things that you will observe is that once he is speaking to a constituent, you cannot interrupt him. His focus is complete. And so I had to take a couple minutes, sir, to be able to speak to the character and the focus of the person, and to officially welcome the Honourable Member to this place. Sir, you know, it is difficult for me, and this does not happen often, to even begin to frame any kind of reaction to the member who spoke before, the Honourable Member who spoke before me. To hear the words in an intervention, "This is more than a comma," in response to two words in an amendment, the two words being "an actuary," really tells us that we have gone beyond the pale. The fact is, sir, that these amendments do something that modern legislation increasingly is doing, which is helping to shift the burden of reporting and of accurate reporting to the companies, to the private sector, to be able to make sure that beyond having static limits for statutory funds, that the kind of information that is reported by these insurance companies, how often it is reported, the categories of data, all of those things lend to the Commission, the Financial Services Commission, being able to monitor in an ongoing way what the levels of profitability, the nature of assets, and so on that are reported as a part of the insurance business being carried out by this company. Shifting the burden of accuracy and accountability to those in the sector is nothing new. Being able to govern or to monitor by guideline, the central bank does it all the time. Not everything is prescribed in regulations or in legislation. Other financial institutions that are tasked with governance and are tasked with surveillance and supervision do this all the time. Issue from time to time guidelines to be able to control or to perform surveillance on the activity of the companies or the banks and so on that they supervise. And now we are being asked, having been told that there may not be any credible actuaries in Barbados, I don't know where that has come from, because there are several. Now we are being asked, now this is a bit of a pivot now from saying we're bringing in too many people. Now we're being asked to bring in people to perform a function that is done every day. It is no different from an accountant preparing a financial statement on behalf of a company that then becomes subject to surveillance, or then becomes subject
Your Honor,
to
Your Honor, may I raise on a point of order, please?
What is the point of order?
Yes, I think the honourable member is misleading the chamber when she misquotes me as having said that there are no credible actuaries in Barbados. I don't believe you heard me say that, sir. I would have said that there are actuaries in Barbados, but always the possibility maybe that they have a direct or indirect relationship with the company. I would not want it to go abroad, whether by mischief or by accident. To hear the honorable member say that, I say that there are no credible actuaries in Barbados. In fact, I went on to say that the actuaries tend to be very bright people, except that it may be difficult, and that they're so bright, so there's few of them, few people who do actuarial studies in Barbados. And that I said that because the numbers may be so small, the numbers of actuaries are comparatively small in relation to other professions, that you may have to find that it is difficult to find one who is not directly or indirectly related to the companies. I'm obliged to you, sir.
Thank you, sir. I will not spend too much time debating this, except to clarify that I did hear correctly. The notion that because this is an area where people are so bright that you don't tend to find many in Barbados, I don't know what that means to tell us about the level of intelligence of Barbadians. I was reporting that exactly what I heard, and Hansard will bear me out. But I move on, sir. And the fact is that actuaries, accountants, people that work in financial services are in the habit of preparing financial statements and records on behalf of companies as a part of their professional duty, and indeed keeping to a certain professional standard. Just as lawyers are meant to, just as any other profession is meant to. And so the fact that one, and I'll get into a little bit more into why we are seeking to move to a regime that is more flexible, but I would not want for Barbadians to believe that it is impossible to find an actuary without some tie to a company. The actuarial services that are provided to companies are just as regular as any accounting services or legal services or any other. It happens in Barbados every day. And so I set that aside, sir, as quite frankly, not even worthy of a further discussion. Sir, the fact is that these amendments to the Insurance Act become necessary because of the constantly evolving insurance industry and really the overall investment space in which we find ourselves. We have seen, and we've experienced it in Barbados, that there are all kinds of new products coming on the market. There are all kinds of differentiated services coming on the markets, and increasingly, borders are being removed more and more. when it comes to international financial services, which in fact has been one of the areas that has contributed to the tremendous growth here in Barbados over the last 3 decades. More and more, this is becoming internationalized. We've seen just recently the establishment of an insurer here in Barbados whose insurance products are related to blockchain technology. We are seeing more and more with our interest in and our need to have concerns about the climate crisis, that there are all kinds of climate-related insurance products and all kinds of climate-related insurance questions. We've seen that there are new carbon market platforms where carbon pricing and the sale of carbon credits also now necessitates a completely different accounting and insurance framework. And so every day, new products are being created. And it means that the existing legislation that simply sets a dollar amount in terms of statutory funds that must exist for these very prescribed products no longer serve us. And the Financial Services Commission needs to have the flexibility to be able to issue guidelines and to be able to allow the industry to become compliant internationally with some of the new requirements that have been established. So we see more and more that companies are being asked to make climate-related disclosures that have to do with the risks as well as the opportunities that are being created in the context of the climate crisis. Companies are being asked, and investors are being asked to quantify physical risks. They're being asked to quantify transition risks. And transition risks relate to what are the financial and economic and human costs of moving towards a low-carbon economy. What are the kinds of products that now are being created? How are we able to keep monitoring the kinds of risks that are now being created, not just in the particular jurisdiction, but in neighboring jurisdictions? Because as we heard from the Honourable Member for Christchurch East Central, the idea of insurance has to do with pooling risk and being able to diversify your exposure to some of those risks. And so this is not the old market that we're used to. Even in terms of life insurance models and types of products, there are all kinds of different products that are being offered now. And so it means that the Financial Services Commission has to follow the rest of the world because, again, this is an international sector. Investors are diversifying their exposure to risk by putting some investment in this market versus that market. I understand the risk that I face in Barbados, and I am going to hedge that risk against being able to invest in Curacao or in Trinidad and Tobago, in different sectors, in different geographical areas. That is the nature of the sector. And it means, therefore, that there need to be internationally comparable standards for the data that companies are submitting in order to be regulated by the Financial Services Commission. So it means, sir, that there's now a reduced emphasis on these very specific rules that are going to be enforced by the regulator. An increasing emphasis, I mentioned earlier, shifting the burden, increasing emphasis on what are the governance structures, what are the reporting guidelines that mean that the institution is able to follow good financial practices. And that's what the Honourable Member was referring to. The Honourable Member for Christchurch East Central was referring to when he talked about a move towards risk-based supervision. So we understand what risk means and looks like. And one of the reasons that this is so important for our market is that Barbados struggles itself with the idea of quantifying risk. Barbados often, as a market, as a country, often has to be a part of conversations with other countries, with international financial institutions, to give them an understanding of the real risk that their investments face, because often we're painted with the same brush. And a part of our job is to be able to help the market, through the data that we collect, adequately quantify the risk that they are really facing. And I'll tell you a little bit further what I mean, sir. There are those who believe that every country in a particular geographical area faces the same kinds of physical risks from climate. And we know that's not the case. We know that some of those risks can be offset by good governance, by investments in adaptation, so things like sea defense walls, and other kinds of investments to mitigate against investment loss. And so we, as Barbados, have to be able to frame and tell the story about what is the true risk that is represented in different sectors in which you invest. So, sir, it means that for an insurance company that is planning to introduce a new product, the focus cannot just be on what is the quantum of resources that you've set aside, but it has to be on whether the insurer not just has sufficient capital, but whether the way that they're collecting information, the way that they're categorizing assets, the kinds of supervision they themselves are involved in, are going to allow them to adequately manage current and future risks. Sir, in 2017, the International Accounting Standards Board introduced something called IFRS 17, the Honorable Member for Christchurch East Central made reference to, the International Financial Reporting Standards. This is in 2017, and they were meant to come into effect from 2021, but eventually, because countries and companies had to prepare, they determined that these would come into effect, I believe, from the beginning of 2023. And it gives a bit of an indication of how the industry is changing and why these changes are necessary. So, for example, under the old IFRS, IFRS 4, which was established in 2004, companies were measuring insurance contracts using historical information. We suffer from that, sir. We in Barbados suffer from that. We suffer from being assessed on old measures of GDP. So you know what that's like. You can't really have a dynamic economic response or economic assessment if you are measuring based on old data. And so under the new IFRS 17, companies have to measure insurance contracts at current value. Companies have to consider the value of money, the time value of money, when it's estimating payments to settle claims. Companies have to measure insurance contracts based on the obligations that are created by those contracts, so that companies have to be able to report more clearly on their profitability. These are the kinds of changes and the kinds of reporting that have now become necessary for markets in Barbados and for companies in Barbados. The application of consistent accounting frameworks across all jurisdictions. So this IFRS 17 is really the first international accounting standard that applies to all countries. Before, countries were allowed to have their own standards. So it means that I'm comparing apples and oranges. If I have an investment in Geneva, I can't compare it with my investment or my accounting standards in Barbados. It means, sir, that I can't compare among industries. I can't see how my investments in green technology are doing against investments in infrastructure. So, sir, it is a way to modernize the insurance market such that people are better protected, such that there is reference to and an eye to what are the current risks of any new products that a company is getting involved in or attempting to sell to people, the extent to which they will be able to cover any payouts from those new products, and being able to also monitor the governance arrangements in place to make sure that those companies, it's not just about having a set of money that you put aside, but given the day-to-day risks that keep changing every day, is that stock of money enough to cover everything that you might face, enough to cover any call that a client may make on the insurance contract that exists. It is an evolving way to better protect Barbadians who have insurance contracts with companies, increasingly with products that that are new and that are not traditional and that don't have a legacy or a track record in the market. So the fact is that in most mature economies and in most developed countries, insurance liability and responsibility is spread more evenly between the private sector and the public sector. In fact, in most other economies, the private sector carries more of the burden for insurance. That is one of the reasons when we have the climate conversation, we talk about the possibility of wipeout risk. We talk about the possibility that if something happens that completely devastates the country, not only is the country at the individual level grossly underinsured, but we had to build over the years the capacity for the state to make up for that. One of the reasons that we have made such a noise about this issue of loss and damage and wipeout risk is that we don't have as mature an insurance sector with as much coverage as you will find in other jurisdictions and in other countries. So when a hurricane comes in one part of the US, the private sector insurance is such that it is sufficiently spread and the event to which they're responding is sufficiently small that they can respond immediately. In our part of the world, our single small island hit by a major extreme weather event is more likely to be able to have been devastated completely. And that degree of loss cannot be covered by any regular insurance. Conversations about insurance as an instrument to protect us are long overdue. And conversations about the way in which insurance as an instrument can protect individuals is long overdue. You know, we are at the start of another hurricane season. And the fact that we are hearing still about the underinsurance of individuals with respect to homes and other assets is worrisome. The state, the country, the government has pledged to make sure that no Barbadian is left or no resident of Barbados is left out in the cold in circumstances where an event has happened, has taken place, that could not be helped or could not be controlled. But as the Honourable Member for Christchurch East Central alluded to, there is also a role for each of us to play in shoring up the homes that we have in advance, but also in having access to adequate insurance instruments. Now, access to adequate insurance instruments is itself a conversation. To what extent are we able to create instruments to which people find affordable and which people find valuable? That remains an ongoing conversation, but it has to be part of the conversation. It is the same way in which risk related to healthcare have to be part of the conversation in the health financing discussion. Because I recall that back in 2017 or so, we started to discuss the idea of a wealth for health instrument, meaning that if you are exercising, you don't have to go to the gym, you could walk, you do some push-ups. If you are exercising, if you're moving your body, if you are eating well, and I'm not going to go into what eating well means, because there's some of us that think that eating well means buying a $12 protein bar, which is really just fake food anyway. But what the instrument that we discussed at the time had to do with ensuring yourself with the things that you have control over. So that if we can tell, for example, with someone who's on a particular treatment protocol for an NCD, who is following the treatment protocol, who is doing their best to monitor and control their eating habits, and who's moving their body and other markers of health care, that rather than having to pay on the treatment side, that we pay in advance for the fact that you are reducing your risk and therefore reducing the potential cost to the state of having to care for an individual once they become ill. Sir, I raise these things because this is not just an academic exercise. This is not just a question of changing from a statutory fund to a more flexible regime. This is about how do we secure the well-being of Barbadians, not just with respect to their living conditions, the homes in which they live, the assets that they hold, the small farms that they have that help feed their family that will be wiped out in an extreme weather event, their health care and the way that they live, their investments and the way they plan their estate so that they can leave something for their families. These are the kinds of conversations that we need to be having, and this legislation starts to take us towards a more accessible insurance framework and regime where people not only realize that insuring ourselves, not just with insurance instruments, but with the things that we do every day, not only is that important, but that the state has a responsibility to protect clients of insurance companies in a dynamic way, because this is an industry that is constantly changing. Sir, there are many questions to consider when we talk about resilience. And sometimes we get into this idea that resilience is something that you fly overseas and talk about in a boardroom. The fact is, sir, that as the hurricane season begins, when we come to consider the quality of the housing stock and the extent to which people are able to access finance to secure themselves, all of this is a part of that conversation. The new kinds of instruments that are being created have to be able to create some kind of revolving fund, some kind of access that is contemplated through the catastrophe fund, to be able to make these kinds of things available to Barbadians. Because unlike other jurisdictions where the private sector overwhelmingly comes in to respond in circumstances where people find themselves exposed, increasingly small developing countries like Barbados do not have that private sector capacity because of the undersaturation of the industry. And therefore, it falls to the state through its regulation in advance, and then we hope that we will not have to, but then after the fact, by being able to come in and play that role of being able to rebuild and make sure people are properly recited and are able to get on with their lives in the event that there is some major weather event. This legislation relates and will tend to relate mostly to the kinds of insurance products that we already have in existence. Life, motor vehicle, the kinds of things that Barbadians tend to already invest in. But the point is that increasingly that profile is changing. Increasingly we are seeing different types of insurance products, different types of insurance models. We want people to continue to invest or to begin to invest in this kind of insurance. I think that there is still a role to be played to be able to settle an affordable insurance model for most Barbadians. But we know that often people tend to value the money they have today and see less of the value of money that they invest now for later. But increasingly, all of us in here who represent people know that if we do not plan adequately for the lives of the loved ones that we leave behind, that the assets that we have worked hard to build increasingly will lose value. I don't need to talk too much, sir, about the homes or the buildings that we pass that have become derelict. Mainly because we have neglected to adequately indicate to whom should they pass or under what circumstances. Equally,
Your honourable member has 2 more minutes.
I thank you, sir. Equally, there's also scope to be able to make less burdensome the requirements of being able to prove succession or to be able to handle the estate of a deceased person once that person has passed on. These are the kinds of things that cost, that we end up losing assets, we end up losing the assets that our hard work have created, we end up being unable to pass them on because we don't have the wherewithal to one, do the planning, and then to have administered the letters of administration, the wills that go through probate, all of these things that increasingly people find inaccessible and unable to be navigated. This, sir, is a single discussion. It is about these very necessary amendments towards this risk-based system that keeps people protected, but it is also, as part of the conversation, about how we protect ourselves, the work that we do to make sure that while we are here, we are protected, and that when we are gone, our loved ones are able to benefit from the legacy that we have left. Sir, I'm obliged to you.